I thank that speaker for his comments and recognise the Deputy Prime Minister from Brandeis B.
I'm mildly entertained. So we hear in the beginning, but you can't do this. The definition of asylum is such that it's not the resolution. Yes, in fact, we're proposing changing that definition. So what are we proposing? I think I've explained it quite clearly. We ought to change the system so that we view asylum as situations in which the system, the sort of institutionalized structure is such that it's violating the rights of individuals. Those people ought to be able to plead for asylum. What I've explained that I don't think they ever address is that this certainly fits. We'll be looking at that more in a minute. So what am I going to do in today's speech? I'm going to refute their arguments first, sort of expand on the idea of why governments have an obligation to uphold exactly what Evan was talking about, and then look a little more in depth at some of the arguments that we presented to you. So what do we actually hear from them? We first hear about their sort of definitional argument, and then they go into two interesting things. One is that this just can't work because the cost of living is just so much higher in New York City and these other areas. It's just not plausible to do these things. And in this is sort of this strange implication that I think is actually addressed by Oxford when they raise the POI, and they go like, really? Are you kidding? Like, really guys? Are you kidding? Go for it.
Given that in most developing countries there's a lack of economic and social rights, how many refugees do you actually think are going to use your system?
Okay, this is interesting. So first of all, we can get, as Evan said, a lot of applications and take the most dire ones, right? We certainly accept that we can't do everything. So they're in a weird bind here. Either we help the people on the very bottom, where their governments are not providing the necessary services so that they can have a basic life, or we don't accept many people at all, and none of the harms they're talking about would at all exist, but we still get all the symbolic benefits that we talked to you about in our speech. They can choose whatever they want, or both, we're fine. So, let's continue down. Because I think when they talk about how the costs of living are going to be higher, they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the world. Look, living anywhere in the United States is comparatively better than living in most places in the developing world. All you have to do to know this is walk outside for 3 or 4 blocks and look at the shacks that individuals are living in. And this isn't like the poorest of the poor areas. Recognize the level of class differences we see. Lower class in America, difficulty in America, is very, very different from difficulty in the developing world. When we talk about extreme poverty, we're talking about people who not only have nothing, but have no chances. People who not only have no food, but no access or ability to get food. These people cannot pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They can't go find a job at the local 7-Eleven. They don't exist. They can't do these things. That's why they're in such a desperate situation. But let's keep going. Because they say, look, it's going to be really bad when there's just a flight of workers. What will happen were you to accept the population of a country into your own? Okay, let's not accept the population of a country into our own. I'm sort of surprised this is their argument. Why don't we take, as Evan said, the most extreme cases? Our argument, well, it might be nuanced, I think it's terribly simple, and that is this. We look at things on a case-by-case basis. We understand that there are cases in which this is advantageous because we understand it fits not only with our idea of rights, but also with our concept of how governments might want to have soft power, use this to their advantage, use that as a political tool, as Evan explained, when they don't want to condemn a government, but still want to accept in individuals who are desperate. We can then use it to send it like sort of 2 symbols, one to the government, another to the people, sort of making it so we look in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of everyone in this community, like we care about them. We think that's a distinct advantage we get, and we can better do it on our side of the house. I don't think we have to advocate for accepting an entire country of shortages.
But Joel, 1 billion people live under the World Bank standard of poverty. What is your definition that's actually going to make your side work?
Our definition is look at what they say, look at their situation, pick the dire ones. What is our definition now of extreme oppression by immutable traits? How do we define extreme? I don't know. I think we look at it on a case-by-case basis. If we can look at extreme for immutable characteristics of prosecution, we can look at extreme for economics. I think we should just use the same definition of extreme that you would like to use. So, the final thing to talk about is the message to the country. I think that there's a couple major issues with this. Because the idea that the message is that the country is irredeemable seems flawed on a number of levels. First of all, it's because they say, look, we're crowding out more legitimate applications. but they've never answered the question of what a legitimate application is. I don't think they've at all explained it to us. What we would say, and this is where I want to get into sort of the new thing that I'm adding in on top, is the idea that a legitimate claim is a claim that's, one, beneficial to the government, which I've talked about, but two, a legitimate claim, I think, is something in which your rights are pretty clearly oppressed. So we would say, what is our idea of government? How ought governments to function? And I know this is a sort of extreme stance, but I would say to the extent possible, governments ought to function by disregarding national boundaries when looking at claims of rights. We don't think that there's a moral claim associated with boundaries other than the fact that it provides disparate levels of rights, which in no way correlate to the liberal democracy's idea of unalienable rights. At that point, we think whenever they can, they all ignore those national boundaries to try to uphold rights claims. And I think what Evan pretty clearly explains in his first point that they never get to is that there are in fact rights tied to economics. What we hear from Jason, the one thing he says is, but you don't have a right to standard of living. Guys, you have a right to not starve to death. You have a right to not be in situations where you have no chance of advancement. What Evan explains, no thank you, is that there is no distinguishing factor in most liberal democracies between the idea of having something inflicted on you as a negative harm and it happening to you. In both of them, when we look to the consequences of extreme economic deprivation are such that you cannot have your rights. You cannot actualize your rights. You can't go to the polling stations when you're starving to death. You can't do any of those things. At that point, I think it's fairly clear that your rights are being deprived in a very meaningful sense and in equal sense to the terms we're talking about. But then I'm going to talk to you about the advantages of the accepting government, how it's good symbolically, how it's good for soft power, how this is a useful tool. I don't think we hear good responses to this. It seems what we get is, but you're sending a message that we're giving up. Are we sending a message that we're giving up on governments when we accept people from their countries by saying they're prosecuting people? Because we would say maybe that's not a message we always want to send. We'd say maybe we want to look at things on a case-by-case basis. But we would further say it's not a message of giving up. It's recognizing the human cost associated with free trade, associated with the things that we have, that people are more than statistics, and sometimes we all care about them. So what have we shown you today? I think we've shown you that the idea of government is to, in some level, uphold these rights. Because that's sort of the world, that's the idea of government that we would want to actualize. That's what we want government to do. But we further shown you that I don't think there's any real grounds for opposition. And there are clear, distinct political advantages to the Western democracies doing this. We are very proud.